Founder of Standard Oil Company, he was America's first billionaire. In a sense, the goal of any capitalist is to make money, and John D. Rockefeller could serve as the poster child for capitalism. A young John Rockefeller entered the workforce on the very bottom rung of the ladder as a clerk in a Cleveland shipping firm. Always thrifty, he saved enough money to start his own business in produce sales. When the Civil War came, the demand for his goods increased dramatically, and Rockefeller found himself amassing a small fortune. When Edwin Drake discovered oil in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania, Rockefeller saw the future. He slowly sold off his other interests and became convinced that refining oil would bring him great wealth. Rockefeller introduced techniques that totally reshaped the oil industry. Yeah, not that kind of oil. This kind of oil. In the mid-19th century, the chief demand was for kerosene. In the refining process, there are many byproducts when crude oil is converted to kerosene. What others saw as a waste, Rockefeller saw as gold. He sold one byproduct, paraffin, to candle makers, and another byproduct, petroleum jelly, to medical supply companies. He shipped so many goods that railroad companies drooled over the prospect of getting his business. So what he demanded were rebates from the railroads. The major eastern railroads like the New York Central, the Erie, and the Pennsylvania, they all wanted to ship oil and were willing to give discounts or rebates to these really large shippers. Now, rebates were customary, and they dated back to the first shipments of oil. As the largest oil refiner in America, Rockefeller was in a really good position to save money for himself and for the railroad. He promised to ship 60 carloads of oil daily and provide all the loading and unloading services. All the railroads had to do was to ship it east. So Commodore Vanderbilt of the New York Central was delighted to give Rockefeller the largest rebate he gave any shipper for the chance to have the most regular, quick, and efficient deliveries. When smaller oilmen screamed about rate discrimination, Vanderbilt's spokesman gladly promised the same rebate to anyone else who would give him the same volume of business. Well, since no other refiner was as efficient as Rockefeller, no one else got Standard Oil's discount. Many of Rockefeller's competitors condemned him for receiving such large rebates, but Rockefeller never would have gotten that if he hadn't been the largest shipper of oil. These rebates, on top of his remarkable efficiency, meant that most refiners, they just could not compete. And it actually transferred this cost over to consumers because if he was paying cheaper rates, the products of oil themselves started to decrease. So from 1865 to 1870, the price of kerosene dropped from 58 to 26 cents per gallon. Rebates were not the only thing that Rockefeller did to basically bring a lot of controversy surrounding his business practices. He also practiced something called a trust. Now, a trust is a combination of firms formed by a legal agreement. Now, trusts often reduce fair business competition, and I'm going to tell you why. Because it leads to something called a monopoly. Standard Oil gained a monopoly in the oil industry. It means they controlled the oil industry. And they did this by buying rival refineries and developing companies for distributing and marketing its products around the globe. In 1882, these various companies were combined into the Standard Oil Trust, which would control, now get this folks, 90% of the nation's refineries and pipelines. Rockefeller's strategy of establishing a virtual monopoly over one aspect of the production process, and in his case it was oil refining, that's labeled a horizontal integration. In order to exploit economies of scale, Standard Oil did everything from building its own barrels to employing scientists to figure out new uses for petroleum byproducts. Rockefeller was becoming more and more controversial, even with the general public. In fact, it led to widespread disgust and revulsion among people who had their businesses or jobs wiped out by this ruthless predatory tactic of the trust, but also by countless others who were affected by the increased costs and reduced levels of service that often resulted from the elimination of healthy competition. The monopolization of the economy also became a major topic for the print media, which helped to create a widespread awareness not only of the effects of this consolidation, but also of the techniques that were being used to attain it, including extensive use of fraud, political corruption, and even physical violence. The media attack on monopolies and corruption reached a peak from around 1902 to 1912, which is often referred to as the muckraking decade. And this period saw the publication of more than 1,000 articles providing detailed accounts of the economic and political corruption caused by big business, especially the trusts. And this surge was facilitated by any kind of advancement in the printing technology field, including the development of the halftone process. Okay, so just to let you know, it just simply made the low-cost production of really fancy illustrated magazines that now were becoming very affordable to the masses. In 1904, muckraker Ida M. Tarbell wrote an expose history of the Standard Oil Company for McClure's magazine. Tarbell's magazine series, The History of the Standard Oil Company, would not only change the history of journalism, but also the fate of Rockefeller's empire, exposing him for his unethical business practices. In 1890, the United States Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was the very first federal legislation prohibiting trusts and combinations that restrained trade. And 2 years later, the Ohio Supreme Court dissolved the Standard Oil Trust, declaring that it was a monopoly. Some interesting information is that Andrew Carnegie wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, and it struck a chord in Rockefeller, wind up strengthening his resolve to support worthy causes. Before his death in 1937, Rockefeller gave away nearly half of his fortune. Churches, medical foundations, universities, and centers for the arts received hefty sums of oil money. Rockefeller suffered from alopecia, and he lost all hair from his body and head. So beginning in his 40s, he lost all the hair from his head, his mustache, and his body. It never grew back. And in the early 1900s, the tycoon began to wear rotating wigs of various lengths to give the impression of his hair growing and being shorn. Rockefeller lived so long that his life insurance company had to pay him $5 million. His life spanned from the presidency of Martin Van Buren to that of FDR, before his death at the age of 97. When Rockefeller turned 96, his insurance company was required to pay him the $5 million face value of his policy. On September the 26th, 1855, A Cleveland merchant company, Hewitt and Tuttle, hired Rockefeller as a teenager to be their assistant bookkeeper. And from that year forward, the tycoon celebrated Job Day every September 26 to commemorate his entrance into the business world. And he actually considered that date more important than his own birthday. So, should Rockefeller be placed on a pedestal for others as a captain of industry? Or should he be demonized as a robber baron? Regardless, he became a hero to many enterprising Americans.